Hello, and welcome to Atopic Dermatitis. It's more than skin deep. I'm Dr. Peter Leo. I'm a clinical assistant professor of dermatology and pediatrics at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine in Chicago, Illinois.
Hi, I'm Melinda Gooderham, a dermatologist and clinical researcher from Peterborough, Ontario, Canada, and assistant professor at Queen's University.
Thank you, Dr. Gooderham, and welcome. And I'd like to welcome all the listeners to our first episode of a podcast series on the psychosocial impact and burden of immune based conditions. Today, we're going to be talking about atopic dermatitis, something near and dear to both of our hearts, something that we are focused on in our practices. And Dr. Godorum, I'd love to start out with a kind of a general question. When we think about mental health and well being, this connection that we see so powerfully reflected in our patients with atopic dermatitis, and we can see how the disease has an effect on these essentially every day. But when you think about that, what domains of living or quality of life do you feel are impacted by atopic dermatitis? What do you see in your practice, and what kind of questions do you ask?
Wow, it's such an impactful condition. It's hard to think of what's not impacted by atopic dermatitis, especially when you're thinking about the moderate to severe population, because this condition, for the most part, has been going on since childhood, even infancy for some. So it's really had impact building over the years. And with itch being the most prominent feature, we know itch can affect sleep. And when people don't sleep properly on a regular basis, it can really start to affect their mental health and well being. So this is things like ability to do your job or go to school, and we know patients are missing work and missing school. It's affecting your relationships with your family, with your coworkers, with your friends, and it's affecting how you feel about yourself. And there's in the community stigmatization for kids, there's bullying. So it can really impact on how patients feel about themselves, and that can reflect on everything.
That's so powerful. And I love the way you put it that it's easier almost to think about what is not connected because there's so many pieces. When you think about the literature on this, there are many studies that support this as well. Obviously, we know as clinicians, we see it. But when you think about the data, do you feel that this is quite robust in terms of showing that connection, showing the connection to disease severity, but even showing that with treatment, we see improvements in these measures as well?
Yeah. It's interesting because patients or even their primary care providers don't realize that they're linked. A patient with atopic dermatitis may also present on a medication for anxiety or depression. And all the way along, no one's ever thought of them as being linked. It's almost like they're unlucky that they had these two or three diagnoses. So I think bringing awareness to that, combination is really important. For the data that's out there, there's so much data out there, and even just preparing for this podcast, I was trying to look it's there's a huge amount. I was focusing a bit on some Canadian data because the Eczema Society of Canada has done a lot of research looking at, the moderate to severe population, in Canada, and the numbers are actually track around the world, doesn't matter where you look, but anxiety, depression are really the biggest in Canada, and moderate to severe. Two-thirds of patients report having anxiety and almost half report having depression. I think the results are similar in the US.
It's really staggering. One of the pieces that I saw recently was a paper talking about there's a disconnect too between getting people better and really getting the kind of impact on quality of life where it essentially has no impact. And it's amazing. Like you can get people 75% better with their skin and they still are often suffering. It's like you have to get a tremendously high bar covered and cleared before you really can say the patient is doing great in terms of sleep and mental health. So I just think it's so true. It's a global problem, and the other piece that I think about a lot is it's not often just the patient that we're seeing. It often has an effect on the siblings and the other family members. Do you find that in your practice as well?
Oh, yeah, very, and there also is a lot of publications on this as well, on the impact of the family. In fact, there's the DFI questionnaire, which is the, dermatitis family impact, where you're right, not only on the parents, also on the siblings. There is higher rates of divorce among parents who have young children with atopic dermatitis, whether there's, you know, lack of sleep, there's friction in medical decision making. And I think you probably see this the same where sometimes when you're giving prescriptions for topical therapy to some of the kids, you have to give two prescriptions, one for each home that they live in. So it seems to
Yes.
be a common thread. And I have seen in some of the patients that I've been following over my 20 years of practice where families have split up. And the atopic dermatitis on its own is an issue, and then you have the other psychosocial problems going on in the background too that are also impacting the patient.
It's really horrible. You see that it can tear families apart, and you can understand it because we know these families are carrying so much extra burden, not only financial burden, of course, but time burden, and even just the fact that there's this mental burden of having to remember and do all these things and go to these visits and stay on task. It's disruptive. When we look at mental health statistics and atopic dermatitis, it does seem like there is, again, this very powerful connection with anxiety, depression, and even things like suicidal ideation. In your experience and from your reading of the literature, do you see that reflected in Canada and throughout the world as well?
Yeah, it's very much so. And I think you brought it up a little bit earlier, where we start to see the impact of the treatment. And so some of newer therapies, the newer targeted therapies, like I've had patients say to me, therapy X actually saved my life. Like, I didn't tell you this before, but I had been thinking, I've had thoughts of ending it. And he's like, and then you introduced me to this new therapy. And he's like, it literally saved my life. So really, patients don't always share the dark thoughts that they have. But I find when you provide them with good care and provide them with advanced therapies and give them that higher level of clearance, like you were saying, even with 75% improvement, we might not see it, but with 90% and with 100% improvement that we can get with some therapies, that's when patients start to open up and really tell you how it was before. If even if they couldn't verbalize and tell you what they were suffering, once you get them better and once you reduce their itch, let them get a good night's sleep, then they can kind of open up and tell you. So I think that's really important then that we learn that from the patients who are better so that we can take that back to the patients who are quiet about how they're feeling, who are, looking in their lap when you're trying to have a conversation with them when their disease is not controlled.
I just love the framing of that. And it's true. I often talk about this idea. I call it the virtuous cycle of drug development. We get better drugs, which then in turn lead to better understanding of the disease itself, which then leads to even better drugs. Like we keep building. And this is one of those things I think it's so neat to frame it that way that I don't think we necessarily could perceive and appreciate the impact of this mental health aspect on these patients until we got them better. And as you say, once you get people better and they saying, I got my life back. I'm sleeping again. I feel like I'm myself again. You realize, wow, this was bigger than I realized.
Yeah,
And we just didn't have the tools before.
exactly, exactly. And one thing you were saying before about like the sleeping patterns, and so many times we are able to get a great therapy, improve the itch, improve the skin. And I'll say, how are you sleeping? And patients will often, I've heard this many times, like, oh, don't worry about my sleep. I've never been a good sleeper. So they almost like these bad sleeping patterns have just been going on their whole life. They don't expect to improve even once we can control the itch and improve the skin and things like skin pain as well. So I think that really speaks to why it's important to start treating patients earlier in their life before these disruptive sleep patterns form, before they can develop a lot of these mental health issues. So it's like that push to, of course, come up with better drugs, but use them earlier in the life journey of this disease so that patterns and diagnoses don't accumulate, if you know what I mean.
I love that. No, I think that's so important. And I talk about that a lot that if we let this continue to cycle, you sort of strengthen those negative pathways and build these bad habits that sometimes can be almost impossible to break. And of course, it's not, again, not just on the patient, but the whole family. And the kind of question I want to ask you is do you feel that you've also seen the impact on mental health when the patient gets better? Have you seen that in the family members too, where everybody else seems better rested and perked up?
Yeah, definitely. Early on when you first meet a patient and their family, the frustration in the room is palpable. Sometimes there's either no dialogue or too much dialogue, and you really feel that stress and that tension. But once you get control of the disease, and if the family comes back together, you start to see how what impact. The other thing I love is when adolescents or teenagers come back for their follow-up without their parents, because now they've got that confidence, and they come to the visit. Before, when they were not doing well, the parents are there. They want to, ask you all these questions. And then you get them under control. Now that we have great drugs that we can use in this population now, it's not just adults who qualify. Children, adolescents can be put on these targeted therapies. And then the teen will come in by themselves for their appointment, and you just feel that confidence, and you know that the parents aren't as worried about them, that they didn't feel they had to come along as well.
Oh, I love that. And I think you've alluded to some of this already, but when you're thinking about tips for addressing the mental health impact associated with atopic dermatitis, are there certain things that you like to use in clinic? Maybe certain tools, or it sounds like one of the key questions is asking about sleep, but what else do you like to do to get a sense of where they're at?
Trying to find out, first of all, what their disease keeps them from doing. Like, what is it with your atopic dermatitis? Is there something that you would like to be doing that this is keeping you from? So then you can get an idea, especially in that adolescent population who may not be so verbal to tell you, I love playing hockey, but I haven't played this year because of my disease. And then you start to see how it's impacting their daily life and the things they enjoy. And if they're not doing what they enjoy, I think that's a huge red flag to me. But PHQ-2 is very easy to just ask somebody a couple questions. And there is some research on that, actually, showing that there's double the odds of having a positive PHQ-2 in patients with atopic dermatitis. So 44% chance it's positive compared to 22% in the other rest of the population. So if you want to do a screening tool that's easy, the PHQ-2 I think is worth it. Otherwise, just having the dialogue, asking them how they're doing, find out what they're not doing, can also give you that information. How about you? How are you doing it in your clinic?
I love that. And I think for most of my career, I've sort of just asked the questions, gotten to know the family sort of pointedly, how is it keeping you back from things? How is it affecting your hobbies? But now I will say I'm a bit of an evangelist for the atopic dermatitis control tool, the ADCT. It's 6 questions, it takes, like, a minute to ask it, and I just love it because it really does it's very patient focused, it asks questions the patients I think really are interested in talking about, but it also gives you a number, and the magic of that, to me, I feel like it's a bit of a frame shift. I love the idea of not worrying about severity so much, like, how severe is it? It's like, well, that's important, but that's not the whole story. It's, are you under control? And that's what's so magical about that for me. I'm asking, are you really there? And sometimes patients look much better and they seem like they're better, and then you get a number that's above 7, that cutoff is 7. You want to be below it, and they're like a 10. You say, I don't think you're under control where we want you to be at. And I've had patients then tear up and say, I think you're right. Now that you've asked these questions, you sort of framed it a little bit more solidly. You've given me something to think about. I think you're right. And that's powerful. And again, it's especially powerful now that we have some more tools in our toolbox. There was a point not that long ago where you would just sort of shrug and say, well, all right, we'll keep trying. I don't have many other things. But finally, we can say, you know what? I think it's time to escalate that to the next level.
No, that's great. I'm gonna take that back to my clinic.
Check it out. I think you'll like it. The last piece I want to ask you before we kind of conclude and wrap up is just when patients, if they do seem like they're having serious mental health impact, and maybe it's beyond or in addition to what we can do from their skin, where do you usually send them for help? What kinds of resources do you usually recommend?
Well, the Canadian healthcare system is a bit limited in some of the consults that you can get. Thankfully, we do have a more urgent online um, psychiatric assessment tool if you want something that's a little more rapid. Otherwise, primary care, we have a lot of nurse practitioners who you can also reach out to. So that primary care piece, I really think it's important because they also are very familiar with the rest of the family. Unfortunately, not everybody here has a family doctor, so that is a bit of a challenge. And that's when I go to the online resources to make sure my patients are getting the care that they need.
I really like that, and I'm with you. It's the same here. It's very challenging to get a rapid mental health consult if you need one. So I think we do have to try to guide our patients as best we can. And I also am a big fan of using things like connecting them with the societies earlier on. Obviously, if they're in extreme issues, we have to do something more. But for patients that I feel like need a little support, having that group support can be helpful. Encouraging from an early point, maybe seeing a therapist to help with them, and often we'll frame it. It's not because you're crazy. It's because this disease is having a huge impact on you, and I want some support for you. So I like getting early, as you say. Early is, I think, better than waiting till they're at that point where we're really scared.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to thank you so much for joining me today and for chatting with me today. And I'd like to thank the listeners for listening in. I think our take home messages are that first and foremost, atopic dermatitis is pretty crummy and it has a huge effect on patients and their mental well being and quality of life, and also on that of their families. And frankly, even beyond that, school, work, society, and even us. It's a very, very challenging condition, but we understand that there are tools that we can use to help assess for this. There are resources we can use to help address these things. And of course, we also understand that with the new tools in our toolbox for treating the atopic dermatitis, we can get these patients better than ever before. And we really do see that that has a powerful impact on not only their skin, but also on their mental health and well being. Thank you so much for your attention.